The town hall meeting in the small Pennsylvania church was packed, a sea of faces watching with anticipation. The atmosphere was heavy, a mixture of reverence and curiosity. Donald Trump stood at the front of the room, his presence filling the space, larger than life as always. But tonight, he wasn't on a grand stage or in a political arena. This was different. The setting was intimate, the air thick with a solemnity that felt unfamiliar to him. The rows of folding chairs were filled with farmers, teachers, local business owners, and a few scattered reporters who had come expecting the usual, bold proclamations, fiery rhetoric, and perhaps a few headline-worthy remarks. But none of them were prepared for what was about to unfold. Among the audience, in the second row, sat a young girl no older than 8. Her hair was neatly braided, her dress simple, yet her eyes held an intensity that belied her years. Clutched tightly in her small hands was an old, worn Bible, the edges of its pages curled from years of use. She had been waiting for her moment, rehearsing the words in her mind. She had asked her mother the same question a dozen times before, but never had she asked someone like this. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, the girl stood, her tiny frame barely visible among the sea of adults. The murmur of voices fell away as she raised her hand. Trump's gaze swept across the room before settling on her. There was something about her stillness, her quiet certainty, that caught his attention. Then she asked it. "What does God mean to you?" The question struck like a hammer against glass. The room, already quiet, descended into an almost eerie silence. Even the reporters, who had been jotting notes and whispering among themselves, put down their pens. The audience held its collective breath, expecting a swift, confident answer. But for once, the former president hesitated. A man known for his rapid-fire responses and unshakable bravado found himself staring into the eyes of a child who had unknowingly disarmed him. He shifted slightly at the podium, his fingers tapping against the wood, a rare flicker of something uncertain crossing his face. The seconds stretched on, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. The girl's question had been simple, yet profound. It was not a challenge, not a demand for policy or political stance, it was personal. It peeled away the layers of showmanship and rhetoric, leaving only the raw truth beneath. And for the first time in a long time, Trump was forced to confront something beyond the spotlight, beyond politics, beyond power. He took a deep breath. And then he began to speak. The air was thick with expectation as Trump shifted his weight, his fingers now resting still against the podium. He glanced down briefly, as if searching for an answer in the grain of the wood before lifting his gaze once more. His expression softened, and for the first time in years, a different version of himself emerged, not the politician, not the businessman, but a man stripped of the usual armor of bravado. He spoke slowly at first, choosing his words carefully. He recounted his childhood, Sundays spent in the church pews beside his mother, hearing stories of faith and redemption. He spoke of the lessons his father had instilled in him, about resilience, about duty, about the belief that God favored those who worked tirelessly and never gave up. As he spoke, his voice wavered, just slightly, as he recalled moments of loss. The passing of his brother, Fred, the pain of failure, the long nights when he questioned if everything he had built could be taken away in an instant. These were not confessions he was used to making in public, yet here they were, laid bare before a room full of strangers. The little girl in the second row listened intently, her small hands still gripping her Bible. Her question had done something no debate or interview had ever accomplished. It had made Trump pause, reflect, and allow a rare moment of vulnerability to show through. As the room remained silent, Trump exhaled, the weight of reflection settling over him. And as he continued, no one could have anticipated the unexpected twist that was about to unfold. Trump's voice dropped slightly, the bravado that often defined his speeches now absent. He shifted his stance, his usual towering presence appearing, for once, almost human. The audience remained transfixed, each face mirroring the same intrigue, the same curiosity. No one moved, no one dared to breathe too loudly, afraid they might disrupt the moment unraveling before them. He spoke of success, of power, and how neither had ever truly answered the deeper questions that had haunted him in the quiet moments of his life. He spoke of the nights when he had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the choices he had made pressing down on him like 1,000 invisible hands. For all his achievements, for all the towers and headlines bearing his name, he confessed that fulfillment had remained just out of reach. The little girl's question had sliced through the noise, pulling him away from the well-rehearsed responses, the grandstanding, and into the depths of something he had long avoided. It reminded him of childhood innocence, of the kind of faith he had not allowed himself to feel in years. The silence in the room thickened as his words grew heavier. The audience expected a pivot, a return to the sharp rhetoric they were accustomed to, but instead, they received something else: honesty. Trump paused, and for a brief second, his mask slipped entirely. He glanced at the girl again, her small frame still as she waited. In that moment, he wasn't just a former president, a businessman, or a figurehead. He was a man confronted by a truth he could no longer sidestep. Then, as if moved by something unseen, he spoke words that sent a ripple through the room, words that none in attendance would soon forget. And in that moment, the walls he had spent decades fortifying began to crack. The words tumbled from Trump's mouth with a gravity he had not anticipated. He spoke of the loneliness that had accompanied his rise, the burdens of leadership, and the weight of expectations that never seemed to lift. He acknowledged the moments when he had felt truly alone, despite the throngs of people who surrounded him, despite the cheering crowds and flashing cameras. His voice was steady, yet there was an undercurrent of something unfamiliar, perhaps regret, perhaps longing. The child in the front row, her Bible now resting on her lap, had unknowingly peeled back a layer of him that he had long kept hidden. The audience listened, hanging on to every syllable. And for the first time in years, the man who had built an empire on strength and certainty admitted, if only for a moment, that even he was searching for something greater. The room held its breath, the air thick with something unspoken. Trump's voice, once powerful and commanding, softened as he recounted the deepest fears that had plagued him through the years. He spoke of the doubt that clung to him in the still hours of the night, the unshakable questions that neither success nor power had managed to silence. There were moments, he admitted, when he had questioned whether God had been listening at all. He described a lifetime of triumphs, each one dimmed by the ever-present uncertainty of what lay beyond them. As he stood before the crowd, he realized that for all his wealth and influence, he was no closer to the answer than the little girl who had asked the question. And yet, in the asking, something had shifted. The silence was broken by a soft, steady voice. The girl, still clutching her Bible, tilted her head slightly and asked, "Do you think God has forgiven you?" A hush fell over the room once more, but this time, it was different. The question was heavier, more piercing. Trump's fingers tightened around the edges of the podium as he absorbed her words. Forgiveness, something he had rarely spoken of, something he had never asked for aloud. His eyes drifted over the audience, scanning their expressions. Some looked down, avoiding eye contact, as if the question had turned inward, forcing them to consider their own lives. Others simply watched him, waiting. He exhaled deeply, then looked back at the girl. The question demanded more than an answer, it demanded truth. And for the first time in a long time, Donald Trump found himself facing the weight of his past, and the possibility of grace. Trump took a slow, measured breath. He reflected on his past decisions, the grudges he had held, the harsh words spoken in moments of anger. He thought of the people he had crossed, the allies he had lost, and the bridges that had burned over the years. Had he ever truly sought forgiveness, from man or from God? He looked up, his voice steady but carrying an uncharacteristic softness. "I don't know if God has forgiven me," he admitted. "But I do know that I need to try and be worthy of it." The weight of his words settled over the room, and for the first time in a long time, Donald Trump saw a different path before him, one not built on power, but on redemption. But before the room could process his answer, something unexpected happened. From the back of the church, an elderly man slowly stood up. His face was lined with age, his hands weathered from years of work. His voice, though shaky, carried through the room with surprising strength. "I knew your brother, Fred," the man said, his eyes locking onto Trump's. "He was a good man. A kind man. And I know he believed in second chances." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Trump stiffened slightly, his expression unreadable. The old man took a step forward, continuing, "I watched him struggle. I watched him fight his own demons. And I watched him forgive, himself and others. If he were here today, I think he'd tell you that forgiveness isn't something we earn. It's something we accept." Trump's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the podium. His brother's name had always carried a weight he wasn't sure how to bear. The past, once a distant memory, now felt dangerously close, pressing down on him in ways he hadn't expected. The old man sighed, his voice softer now. "If you want to be worthy of forgiveness, Mr. Trump, you don't have to fight for it. You just have to be willing to receive it." The silence in the room deepened, stretching unbearably long. And then, for the first time that night, Donald Trump did something no one expected. He closed his eyes. And he listened. The silence that followed his moment of introspection spread through the room like ripples on a still pond. Some members of the audience lowered their heads, others folded their hands in their laps, as if absorbing the magnitude of what had just been said. The young girl remained motionless, her small fingers gripping the Bible even tighter, her expression one of quiet understanding. A woman in the back wiped a tear from her cheek, while a man in the front row clenched his jaw, his emotions betraying him in the way his fingers trembled slightly. This was not the typical reaction to a political speech. This was something different, something deeper. The weight of the moment settled over the crowd like an invisible force, pressing into their hearts and stirring memories of their own regrets, their own moments of longing for forgiveness. Even the reporters, so used to the predictable patterns of public figures, found themselves momentarily frozen. Their pens hovered above their notebooks, cameras held aloft but motionless. They were no longer merely covering a story, they were witnessing something raw, something unplanned. The elderly man who had spoken of Fred remained standing, his gaze unwavering. He had not intended to change anything, only to speak the truth, but now he saw the ripple effect his words had caused. In that moment, it was not just Trump confronting his past, it was everyone in the room, facing their own reflections in the unspoken confessions of a man who had built a legacy on confidence and control but was now, for the first time, acknowledging the cracks in the foundation. The church, which had seemed so full of whispers and quiet murmurs at the start of the evening, was now the site of something sacred, an acknowledgement of the burdens carried in every soul present. Trump, for his part, remained still, absorbing the energy around him. He had spent his life commanding rooms, leading movements, bending the will of crowds to match his own. But here, in this moment, he was simply part of something larger. No cameras, no applause, no chants. Just a man standing before others, trying to understand what it meant to be worthy of grace. As the room remained suspended in stillness, a single beam of light pierced through the stained glass window above. It fell upon Trump's face, illuminating him in a way that felt almost ethereal. The dust particles in the air caught the glow, swirling as if stirred by unseen hands. A collective shiver ran through the congregation. It was as though time had paused, as if something greater had reached down to touch this moment. Eyes darted to the window, then back to Trump, whose expression wavered between disbelief and something deeper, acceptance. The silence cracked as a low murmur rippled through the crowd, hushed voices exchanging incredulous glances. Some called it coincidence, others called it divine. Regardless of belief, no one in that room would ever forget the moment when light fell upon a man seeking redemption, as though heaven itself had acknowledged his journey. As the gathering in the church slowly dissipated, the air outside carried a cool evening breeze. The stars had begun to emerge, scattered like distant lanterns in the sky. Trump stepped into the churchyard, where a few members of the congregation lingered in hushed conversations. The girl and her family stood together, their expressions filled with quiet gratitude. Trump motioned for the girl's parents to follow him toward a large black SUV parked near the entrance. The vehicle's doors swung open, and a man in a crisp suit retrieved a small box, handing it to Trump. He turned back toward the family, the weight of his earlier words still lingering in his mind. The girl's father hesitated as Trump extended the box. It was finely wrapped, its ribbon tied with a precision that suggested careful thought. When the lid was lifted, inside lay a delicate silver cross on a chain, gleaming under the faint light of the street lamps. There was no speech, no grand explanation. Just an understanding that this was not about politics or power, but something much simpler, an acknowledgement of faith, of connection, of something beyond words. The mother pressed her hand to her chest, and the father gave a solemn nod of appreciation. The girl, holding the cross delicately between her fingers, gazed up at Trump with the same unwavering eyes that had changed the course of the evening. A gentle wind rustled the leaves of a nearby oak tree, carrying with it a sense of finality. The night had begun with a question that challenged the soul, and now, as the last of the congregation made their way home, it ended with something just as powerful, an act of quiet grace. Just as the evening seemed to settle into closure, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed across the gravel path. A man, dressed in a worn military jacket, approached from the shadows near the church entrance. His face bore the marks of hardship, his eyes filled with urgency. The crowd turned their attention to him, sensing something unusual about his presence. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a faded letter, its edges crinkled with age. He extended it toward Trump, his hand steady despite the tremor in his voice. The moment stretched, uncertainty thick in the air. Whatever was written on that paper held significance, and its revelation would shift the course of the night once more. The air grew heavier as Trump hesitated before reaching for the letter. The man, still standing rigid in his worn military jacket, bore the look of someone who had endured storms far beyond the ones visible to the eye. His posture was firm, yet the weight of something unseen pressed on his shoulders. The paper, delicate and aged, trembled slightly between his fingers as Trump finally took it. The crowd watched in silence, their breath collectively held. The paper was old, its creases deep, the ink faded but still legible. Trump's eyes traced the words slowly, his expression unreadable. As the seconds passed, an unspoken tension spread like wildfire. The letter was not addressed to Trump, nor was it meant for the public eye. It was a relic of the past, a note written by Fred Trump Jr., a message meant for a soldier who had once served under him in a quiet act of kindness. The words carried the weight of an old promise, an unfulfilled debt of gratitude, and a reminder of a moment when humanity had eclipsed all else. The soldier's eyes were steady, his face etched with memories too painful to voice. He had carried this letter for years, searching for the right time, the right moment, and now, fate had finally led him here. The weight of its contents had not diminished, but perhaps now, it could be lifted. Trump lowered the letter slowly, his breath caught in his chest. The connection between the soldier and his brother was undeniable, an echo from a time long past but still resonating in the present. He glanced back at the man, his expression uncharacteristically soft, the realization of something larger settling into his features. The crowd, still frozen in suspense, did not yet understand the gravity of the exchange. But for the two men standing there, the letter was a bridge, a moment in time binding them together in a way that no politics, no status, and no words could define. A gust of wind stirred the leaves around them, whispering through the yard like a ghost from the past. Whatever came next would not just be about the letter, it would be about the burden it carried, the past it revealed, and the future it could shape. Trump's fingers lingered on the edges of the paper, as though holding on to something fragile yet immeasurably powerful. The soldier remained unmoving, his stance unwavering. The crowd's murmurs began to rise, uncertainty rippling through them like waves against the shore. Some still wondered what the letter meant, while others sensed the gravity of its presence. The wind shifted again, sweeping the dry leaves along the ground as if orchestrating the moment. Trump exhaled slowly, a rare hesitancy in his movements. He was used to control, used to dictating the pace of any conversation, any event, yet here he was, at the mercy of a past that refused to be ignored. The soldier reached inside his jacket and withdrew something else, a small, tarnished pin bearing an insignia. It had been given to him by Fred Trump Jr. decades ago, a symbol of a promise made in the heat of duty, one that had never been repaid. It was not money, not a favor, but something more profound, an oath of protection, a vow to never forget. As Trump's gaze fell upon the pin, a sharp memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. He recalled conversations with his brother, recollections of moments Fred had spent with the people he served alongside. Fred had always spoken of duty, of loyalty beyond politics or business. Now, standing in the cool night air, those words felt heavier than ever. The soldier placed the pin in Trump's hand, and for the first time in a long while, he was silent. Not as a leader, not as a man known for grand gestures, but as someone being given an opportunity to acknowledge a debt he had never known existed. The audience remained hushed, drawn into the weight of the moment. They were no longer just bystanders, they were witnesses to something more than just an exchange between two men. This was history catching up, a long-forgotten promise finding its way home. The stillness stretched on, until finally, the wind stirred again. And just as before, it carried something with it, not just dust and leaves, but the echoes of an oath finally remembered. Trump's fingers tightened around the pin, feeling the weight of something more than just metal. It was history, a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice, a bond between two men who had never met but were now forever connected. He looked back at the soldier, seeing in his eyes the depth of all he had endured, the silent strength that spoke louder than any words could. The moment stretched, unspoken yet undeniable. Then, as if reaching a decision that had been forming in his mind since the letter had first touched his fingers, Trump turned slightly, motioning toward the SUV parked nearby. The message was clear. He wasn't letting this man walk away into the night, carrying his burdens alone. The soldier hesitated for a moment, glancing at the gathered crowd as if uncertain whether to accept. But there was something in Trump's posture, in the rare sincerity of his gaze, that made the decision for him. Slowly, the soldier gave a small nod and stepped forward. The murmurs in the crowd grew as realization dawned upon them. This wasn't just an acknowledgement of the past, it was an invitation to move forward together. The wind carried the sound of shifting gravel beneath their feet as they walked toward the waiting vehicle, side by side, the weight of history carried not as a burden, but as a bridge to something new. As the soldier stepped into the vehicle, the air between him and Trump was thick with unspoken understanding. The weight of history clung to them, but now, it was no longer a burden to be carried alone. The driver shut the door behind them, and the SUV pulled away from the church, leaving behind a crowd that watched in silence, still trying to process what had just transpired. The road stretched ahead, the headlights carving a path through the dark. Inside the car, there was no small talk, no empty pleasantries. Instead, the rhythmic hum of the engine underscored a moment of reflection. Trump stared out of the window, his mind churning over the past few hours. The soldier sat beside him, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable but calm. They drove for miles, the world outside slipping into a blur of motion. The landscape seemed to shift around them, the passing fields and distant lights morphing into something surreal. The journey felt like more than just physical movement, it was a transition, an acceptance, a step toward something neither man had anticipated. After what felt like an eternity, the SUV slowed and pulled up to a quiet estate. The gates opened, and the vehicle rolled up the long driveway, coming to a stop in front of a grand but solemn house. Trump stepped out first, inhaling deeply as if grounding himself in the present. The soldier followed, his boots pressing into the gravel with measured steps. Inside, the house was quiet, the only sound the distant ticking of an antique clock. A soft glow from a nearby fireplace cast long shadows across the room. Trump motioned toward a chair, offering the soldier a seat. For the first time in a long time, Trump was not the one in control of the narrative. He was simply a man listening to another, absorbing the weight of a story that had been waiting to be told. The soldier reached into his pocket, pulling out another keepsake, a photograph, yellowed with age, creased from years of being held. He placed it on the table between them. Trump's eyes flickered as he picked it up, his fingers tracing the edges. It was a picture of Fred, younger, his face bright with the kind of light that came only from a person who believed in something greater than themselves. Memories stirred within Trump, pulling him back to a time when his brother had been his guide, his moral compass, the one person who had seen the world differently. The image of Fred, smiling and unburdened, stood in stark contrast to the regrets that had haunted Trump for years. The soldier spoke then, his voice low, steady. He recounted moments with Fred, the kind of leader he had been, not with authority, but with heart. He spoke of the nights they had spent discussing faith, the future, and the people they had sworn to protect. He described a man of quiet integrity, a man who had once written a letter that had taken decades to deliver. Trump listened, every word a tether pulling him deeper into a past he had avoided. This was not just about Fred. It was about the choices he had made, the legacy he had built, and the future that still lay ahead of him. A long silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time in years, Trump did something rare. He reached across the table and clasped the soldier's hand firmly. It was a handshake, but more than that, it was an acknowledgement, a silent promise to honor what had been left unfinished. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, there was only the steady warmth of the fire and the quiet understanding between two men who had found solace in an unlikely place. The past had spoken, the present had been acknowledged, and the future, uncertain, but open, awaited. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something neither of them had expected.